Thank you for joining us for another of our Teleworks online lectures. Before we should begin, I'd like to give you some information about the Atelier at Flowerfield, a 501(c)(3) not-for-profit organization. We're currently in our Spring 1 session, and we offer a variety of fine art, drawing and painting classes in many mediums, both online and in studio. And we also offer classes in digital painting, graphic novel, and anime and cartooning. We currently have an exhibition of work by our students and teachers called Lockdown and Beyond, and that will run until May 15th. We welcome people to come and view it, and small groups are okay. We would prefer it if you would call ahead though, if you want to do that. Tonight's lecture is being sponsored by First Republic Private Wealth Management, and we thank them very much. And Helen Harrison, the director of the Pollock Krasner House, will be giving a talk on Jackson Pollock, Creative Imagination. We welcome her this evening, and we hope you enjoy tonight's lecture. If you wish to ask questions, please post them in the chat room. I shall now hand over to Helen Harrison. Thank you.
All right. Well, whatever it was, the Zoom gremlin was really working his magic. But let me just say, by way of introduction, that I'm very, very honored to be asked to do not one, but two talks for you. And the first, of course, was about Lee Krasner and her life and career, which, of course, is intimately involved with Jackson Pollock's. Although, of course, they did not meet until they were both mature people. But Pollock's life took a very different turn from Lee's. He was a country boy. And I'm going to show you a little bit of his background because it does relate to the way he looked at the world and the way his creative imagination was formed. He was born in Cody, Wyoming in 1912. And people think, oh, there's a misconception that he came from the wild, wild west. Well, if you take a look at Cody, Wyoming, I think it looks a little bit more like Levittown than like some frontier shoot 'em up kind of Wild West settlement. It was actually a housing development that was billed as the gateway to the Yellowstone. It was kind of, they used Buffalo Bill Cody's name. He was one of the investors. They used his name as a way of getting people to buy property. And you can see from the interior of the house where Jackson was born that this is a relatively not well-to-do family, but they certainly weren't dirt poor, and they lived a comfortable life. Unfortunately, Jackson's father, Leroy, was not very successful, and he kept having to move from one place and one job and one profession to another. He started as a farmer in Iowa, but the family moved west searching for a better life. They evidently found it in Cody, but they weren't able to maintain it. They moved to Arizona when Jackson was about 2. And here you see him. Oh, he was an adorable kid, the little tow-headed, youngest of 5 boys. You have father Leroy and mother Stella on the 2 flanking the group of 5 boys. And as the youngest, Jackson was the pet of the family. So he was kind of spoiled and indulged from a very early age. When he was about 10, well, I guess he was 8, but between the ages of 8 and 10, the family lived in Janesville, California. They lost the farm in Arizona and somehow scraped together enough money to buy this little inn in Janesville. And this is where Jackson and his brothers were introduced to Native American life, which apparently there was a tribe that lived nearby, and there was an Indian burial ground that had kind of mystical overtones. And there was a Native American woman who was hired to work in the hotel who used to tell stories, the legends and the myths of the Indian people that enthralled and captivated the youngsters. And Jackson remembered quite vividly in later years how his family was interested in Native culture. One of the things that his father did was to, when they moved back to Arizona, when Jackson was 12, he took the boys hiking in the Tonto National Forest, which is quite a wild place. I've been there myself, and the Sierra Ancha cliff dwellings are relatively inaccessible. They must have had to clamber up some pretty steep cliffs to get to them. But there was a lot of rock writing, the petroglyphs and the pictographs in the caves. And you can see here, this particular detail shows a handprint where the paint was sprayed around the hand, so it's a negative shape. And you can see that in Pollock's later work, in a couple of important paintings from the 1940s and early 50s, the handprint plays a very significant role. The idea of imprinting your palm or your hand or your fingers onto a work to give it a kind of signature to show that you were there was quite influential on him. Now, he did kind of cultivate a cowboy image. When he was younger, he did go hunting and he did work on the road crew. His father, again, had problems and he became a surveyor. He gave up farming and he ran the road crew that built the highway that goes to the north rim of the Grand Canyon. And Jackson and a couple of his brothers went to work with him in the summer of 28, and they really were roughing it. I mean, this was a camp, but this was by no means a comfortable situation. And Jackson liked this rugged persona, and even after he moved to the city, sometimes he would dress in cowboy-like outfits just to emphasize his connection to the West. Finally, the family had moved around the Southwest throughout his youth and childhood, and they finally settled in Los Angeles in 1929. And he went to Manual Arts High School, where he was able to take art classes. It was, and I believe it still is, a coeducational vocational school. And he had an art teacher who encouraged him. And his eldest brother, Charles, was a very important influence on him. He had started to study art much earlier. He was 10 years older than Jackson. And he studied at the Otis Art Institute in Los Angeles. And then he moved to New York City to study at the Art Students League with Thomas Hart Benton. And he would write back home to Jackson and say, Benton is a very important teacher. You really should come to New York and study with him if you're serious. So unfortunately, Jackson did not finish high school. He was not a model student, got into a lot of trouble and was expelled a couple of times, and then eventually just quit, and in fact did move to New York City at Charles's behest, and he lived with Charles. But first, Charles came back to Los Angeles for the summer and took Jackson to visit Pomona College in Claremont and to see this mural by Jose Clemente Orozco. The Mexican muralists were very important influences at this time. They were working under government auspices after the 1920 Mexican Revolution. Many artists were hired to decorate public buildings, and several of them came north of the border as well. And in 1930, Pomona College commissioned Orozco to create this mural of Prometheus. It's a true fresco. As you can see, it's 20 feet tall by almost 30 feet wide. It's quite monumental. And it tells the story in images of the Titan, the Greek myth of the Titan, who stole fire from the gods and brought it to humankind. And on one side, you see the people clamoring for it, reaching for it. And on the other side, you see them cringing in fear. And of course, fire symbolizes knowledge. So this is why the university or the college commissioned it as a kind of symbolic representation of knowledge coming to humankind, that it can be used for good or for evil. So when Pollock saw this mural, he was extremely inspired. And he actually kept a reproduction of it in his studio for the rest of his life, because he felt that Orozco really understood how to create monumental form and imbue it with very, very strong emotional content. So Orozco was a very important touchstone for him very early on. Remember, in 1930, he's only 18 years old and not yet really a serious artist, although he obviously had very serious ambition. So he does come to New York and he stays with Charles. And there you see the two of them in Charles's New York apartment. And excuse me, Jackson enrolled at the Art Students League where Thomas Hart Benton was teaching. This is not a picture of a Benton class. I think this photograph was probably taken a little bit later. But the Art Students League was such an important training ground for many, many generations of artists. It was founded in 1875. And practically anyone you can think of was there at one time, including Lee Krasner, very briefly, just a few years before Jackson. She just took one course in the summer, and then she went to the National Academy of Design. But Pollock was there from 1930 to 1933, studying with Benton. And this is where he was living at the beginning, on West 14th Street, in what was then a rooming house. And even then, it had an Italian restaurant on the ground floor. Several of the places where Pollock lived, and he moved from place to place every year until he finally settled in with his brother Sanford. But this is one of the few that does survive. Benton was a very interesting character. I've just made him the central character of a mystery novel that I've written, but he taught at the League from 1926 until 1935, and he cultivated acolytes. He had followers, and he socialized with the students as well. He really created almost a cult around him. And the painting that you see there, The Ballad of the Jealous Lover, it shows you the kind of very Baroque, very stylized figuration that he was known for. And the fellow playing the harmonica was actually posed by Jackson. Jackson worked for Benton as a kind of a babysitter for his two kids. He also helped him to work on mural paintings, although he didn't actually paint them, but he did kind of odd jobs. And he and Benton were very close. Benton was a very strong influence, both artistically and on a personal level. This was painted at Benton's summer getaway. He had a place up on Martha's Vineyard. That's where the pond is. And he would go there every summer from the 1920s right until his death in 1975. And Jackson went up there a few times and stayed with the Bentons. He and his wife, Rita, were very, very encouraging. And you can see the kind of contortion of forms, the exaggeration that Benton was known for. But in Pollock's work, it took on kind of a stronger, darker tone, more emotional, whereas Benton's is more illustrational. There's a certain undercurrent of feeling in Pollock's work, even an early piece like this. The guy's only 22 years old when he painted this. It's quite a small painting, but you get a sense of the turbulence that was in his aesthetic and also in his life, because even at this age, he was an alcoholic. Now, Orozco came to New York right at the same time. So he actually got to meet this artist whose work he admired so much and watch him at work on these frescoes. This is just a section of the murals that he painted in the New School for Social Research, and they are still there. But Benton was working in the building at the same time on murals for a different room. And so during the sessions, he was able to go downstairs and see what Orozco was doing, and also just admire his amazing ability to organize these very, very large sections of wall. This was done according to a system that was invented by a mathematician named J. Hanbidge called dynamic symmetry. And it helped to keep the compositions in check, actually, in this case, maybe a little bit too much, but Orozco and Diego Rivera also experimented with it. So this was a kind of training ground by, not so much by doing, because he was not a real assistant to either Benton or Orozco, not a technical assistant, but by watching them at work, watching them create a painting, compose the imagery, and actually physically execute the work, which was quite demanding, particularly the fresco, which requires assistance. It's work on wet plaster, and it's really quite complicated technically. And then he also was living in this apartment, or rooming house as it was at the time, which still survives, just a few doors from where Lee Krasner would live. This is number 49. She lived at number 51, East 9th Street. So she was just one block away from him. Although, as I say, they did not know each other at the time. He also lived on Carmine Street in this little house, and he would go back to California in the summers to visit family. They would take road trips, either driving with friends or riding the rails. Remember, this is the depths of the Great Depression, 1932. Nobody had any money, and it was very precarious living. Fortunately, Benton came to the rescue and helped him not have to pay tuition at the Art Students League. He made him a monitor. So he was just scraping by. But this kind of hard scrabble life is not encouraging for an artist. People think, oh, starving in a garret, how romantic. It really isn't. It's just drudgery. And fortunately, in 1933, the federal government stepped in with the New Deal and started creating work projects for the artists. And Pollock was able to sign up for one quite early on. The federal art project of the WPA, that came in 1935. There were a couple of earlier programs, and one of which Pollock worked for, but the WPA actually gave them a living wage, $23.86 a week, to do their own work. And they would do a painting such as this one and submit it to the office for allocation to a public building. It could hang in a school or a library or a housing project. And these programs lasted until 1943. So it was a godsend for the artists because it paid them to do their own work in their own studios. Or if they didn't have a studio, or if they wanted to do something special, the project would provide them a place to work and provide materials for them as well. So it was really an unprecedented kind of support for the artists, and it gave them the opportunity to develop their art without commercial pressure, because they were being paid a wage to do it rather than having to take it to a gallery or a dealer or an agent and sell it. So you can imagine what kind of freedom it gave them, although the project was not without its problems. But many of the artists I've known who had worked on it in the 1930s said that it was just amazing the way they were able to do their own work, get a living wage, and they didn't have to think about having dealers, collectors, critics. It just was a whole different art world. Well, during that period, Orozco went from New York up to Hanover, New Hampshire, and painted this enormous program of murals in the Dartmouth College Library. Pollock and several of his friends in 1936 made a pilgrimage up there. One of them had a car, and they drove all the way up to New Hampshire just to see these murals. It's the epic of American civilization, and it begins over here with the so-called primitive people, sort of just unorganized and not having developed a culture yet. Then you have human sacrifice, and you have, we'll go through the conquistadors coming over here, and then the westernization with the school children. And it's all in these vivid colors. It's very large. It's about, I think, 12 feet tall. And this was so impressive to Jackson. He wanted to work large. He had ambition to do this, But again, with Orozco, there was this combination of formal sophistication and emotional content, very, very strong feeling. So that's one of the reasons that Orozco was his major avatar among the Mexicans. And you can even see how he took inspiration from specific motifs in Orozco's work. That is a detail on the top of the Dartmouth fresco. And this painting below by Pollock actually belongs to Dartmouth. They purchased it because of its relationship to the mural. And it's even more symbolic in a sense. I mean, you see the snakes down below the skeletal figure and these writhing figures that actually remind one of the mural at Pomona College. So you can see that Pollock was very, he was searching for this kind of emotional content in his work, but also for a formal direction. But I think the most important technical influence on him was David Alfaro Siqueiros. Siqueiros was a very dramatic figure. You can see the self-dramatization in this self-portrait, but he was very charismatic. Pollock first met him in California when his brother Sanford, the next older than he, was on a mural team working with Siqueiros on an outdoor mural in Los Angeles. And Pollock went home for the summer and met Siqueiros and was very excited by the kind of experimentation that Siqueiros was doing. He was encouraging the artist to use unorthodox materials and unusual techniques. What they did, he came to New York City in 1936, and Pollock had the opportunity to work with him in a workshop where they made floats and banners for the Communist Party May Day parade. Siqueiros was actually on his way to Spain to fight in the Spanish Civil War on the Republican side. And this was kind of an interregnum for him. And you can see one of the floats that they made. It was actually animated. This is not the complete float, but that hammer actually rocked up and down, and it bashed a capitalist who the figure hasn't been put on yet. Anyway, it was really quite something. You can actually find a film of this thing moving on YouTube. But Pollock learned from Siqueiros how to use liquid paint. Here you can see an example of, this is in the Museum of Modern Art. I'm not sure if they have it up at the moment, but this is one of Siqueiros's paintings from that period. It depicts an incident rather like Masada, where a group of natives in Mexico committed suicide rather than be conquered by the conquistadors. And it uses several interesting techniques because you can see the figures down here of the conquistadors. They were made with a kind of template. So sort of like the thousands of screaming extras in a movie where they're all just, you know, it's a CG animation. That's what they did. They made a template and then they sprayed it so that it repeated. So you didn't have to paint each individual figure. And they went out into the street and found gravel. So here you have some gravel ground into the pigment to give it the texture of stone, because this was done on a mountain. And all of this is spray paint. And as you can see, liquid paint. He used peroxylin, which is an automobile finish. And he also used spray guns, anything that would give him the effect he wanted. And that was what he taught Pollock. He said, whatever you need to express, whatever you're trying to achieve, use whatever material will give you that result. So the result was the thing. As Pollock later said, it didn't matter how the paint was put on as long as something was being said. So that was the important thing, that although Pollock later said he did not admire Siqueiros' art, but he admired his ideas. And here you can see him messing around with a spray gun. This might have even been done at the workshop. because it's a lithograph that he had created earlier. It's just a landscape, and he has overlaid it with spray enamel or spray paint so that he gets these kind of misty, cloudy, and fiery effects. Now, we can hardly talk about Pollock without talking about Picasso. And in fact, at the Pollock Krasner House this summer, we're going to do an exhibition that specifically addresses Pollock's debt to Picasso. And one of the most important and pivotal moments in his early development was this exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, which was held in 1939. They had just acquired Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, and it was one of the stars of the show. This had over 300 works in it. It was a huge survey of Picasso's output to date. And it was extremely influential, not only on Pollock, but on the whole of the New York avant-garde, because as Pollock himself said, Picasso had already done it all. How do you overcome that? How do you go beyond the innovation that Picasso had already achieved? So it was intimidating, it was daunting, but it was also very challenging. And nothing more challenging than Guernica. This was painted by Picasso in response to the bombing of a Basque village during the Spanish Civil War by German planes. The Germans were allies of the Franco insurgency. And this village full of innocent Basque people was demolished. And there was outrage, international outrage. And this was Picasso's response. It was painted as a portable mural for display at the 1937 World's Fair in Paris in the Spanish Pavilion. And then it toured to raise money for the Spanish Republican cause. And it came to New York in 1939, and it was shown in a commercial gallery. And then it traveled, and then it came back to New York for the Picasso retrospective. So it was seen in New York twice during that time. And it is monumental. I remember it as a youngster. We used to go to the Museum of Modern Art because they continued to show it until the Franco regime was gone. And it was absolutely overwhelming. And Pollock responded very strongly to the painting and to the many studies and sketches for it that went along with it. And also, of course, it rekindled his thinking about mural painting and reinforced the idea that you could paint a monumental canvas, and even though it wasn't necessarily part of a building like a mural, it could function in a mural-esque way. It could occupy a wall. And many of his friends, such as Seymour Fogel, whom you see here, were doing monumental murals for the WPA. But Pollock actually had no experience of mural painting except watching other people do it. So although he had ambitions, he just never had the opportunity until years later. Another important influence on him was Native American art. Now, he knew this from his childhood. As I showed you, he went climbing in the rocks and saw the petroglyphs, but he never actually saw the Indian sand painters until he came to New York. Sand painting is in essence, a sacred healing ritual. But for this exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, they created a secular version, and it was done in the gallery so that people could observe the technique where colored sand is drizzled along the surface and to create the imagery. And Pollock went to the show, saw this in practice, and even he later kind of acknowledged that he worked on the floor the way the Indian sand painters of the West worked on the floor. So it obviously made an impression on him, although clearly his imagery is very different. But the show also included many, many examples of art from all over the United States, including Alaska. And many of these grotesque masks kind of found their way into his work later on. And here's a very good example. There are quite a few of the works from this period that incorporate Native American symbolism, Native American imagery, and things that he observed either at that exhibition or visiting the Museum of the American Indian up on 155th Street, where it was then. And it clearly had meaning for him, partly because of the symbolism and also because of the spiritual and magical overtones. And like any artist, he was a sponge. He would soak up influences from all different places. The Museum of Modern Art was, of course, the temple where they all worshipped. And in 1941, they had a big Miro exhibition. And following that, Pollock did a few things that kind of referenced Miro. Again, you have a more whimsical approach, perhaps, but certainly this kind of formal distortion, and you can see the different shapes floating, and there's shapes floating in Pollock's work in a similar way. So he's learning something formal as well as in terms of content from observing and from trying his hand at these different approaches. Now, Lee Krasner was very important for Pollock in terms of her support of his work, her belief in him, but also she was his best critic. Even Clement Greenberg, the famous art critic, said that she had the best eye in New York. And for him to say that, that was saying something. She really knew when Pollock's work was cooking and when it wasn't. And she said herself that they didn't really talk shop in the sense that they would discuss different aspects of a work. They would just say, it's working or it's not working. Keep at it, that sort of thing. So that they were constantly encouraging each other. But her approach, as you can see from the canvas on her easel, was much more of a neo-cubist kind of imagery at the time. That's what she was doing when she and Pollock met in late 1941. She was living on East 9th Street. He was a block away on East 8th Street, and his apartment was up here on the top floor. This was his studio, and then he had a little bedroom over here. So she didn't have to go very far to run into him, but she did because the two of them were put into an exhibition together, and she wanted to know all the artists in the show, and she didn't know him. So she went and visited the studio, and according to her, she was just really bowled over by what she saw because the work was so different from what she was doing and from what most everybody else in New York was doing. Oh, by the way, this is what those two buildings look like now. Very different. But this is the work that was in the exhibition that the two of them were in together. Now you can see the Picasso influence, particularly this kind of hand shape here, these fingers, very Picassoid, and also the masks, the Native American influence, and the composition, which is so curving and voluptuous, could come right out of Benton. So it's an amalgam, it's a pastiche. You know, he's still working out an aesthetic strategy that's going to give him the kind of expression that he was after. Oops. Oh, that's Lee in their apartment. She moved in with him in 1942, and she had a studio in the back, and he was up in the front of the building. So they had separate studios. And it was the first sustained relationship that he'd had with a woman. So it is definitely reflected in his imagery. He did a whole series of figure paintings at this time that reference his relationship to Lee. And I think that this very strong physical bond, they were very much in love, and it was very sexual. And I think that it helped him to make his work more exuberant, a little more upbeat than it had been before. And you can still see, like here, maybe a feather headdress, totemic shapes that also reference Native American art, and very, very geometric forms in here that kind of maybe nod a little bit to Cubism, but he really was getting beyond that, and he was going into much more personal, much more subjective territory with these symbolic pictures of the early and to mid 40s. And around this time, he was introduced to Peggy Guggenheim. Now, Peggy was a very important influence, not only because she had this amazing collection where you could examine close up and firsthand the work of all the European modern masters, but because she was a patron. And she opened a gallery in New York in 1942 called Art of This Century. And here you see her in it. It had a rather unusual design, these curving walls with paintings that stuck out on sticks. And she, although she was very sophisticated and a collector of important European modernism, she also wanted to encourage younger American artists. She gave Robert Motherwell his first show, William Baziotis, and Jackson Pollock. And she took him on as a protege, and she actually paid him a stipend. By this time, the WPA was winding down. He and Lee were wondering what they were going to do for money. And Peggy came along and gave him a monthly stipend and commissioned a mural from him. And here he is with the stretched canvas, wondering what he's going to do with it. There's another myth that he painted the whole thing in one night. Not true. He worked on it for several months, but it was the largest work, and still is the largest work he ever did. And it really put him on the map in terms of being taken seriously. Clement Greenberg said that when he saw that painting, he knew that this guy really had something. Not only is it big, it's 20 feet long by almost 8 feet tall, but it's full of these amazing, again, you can see the Benton influence, the Baroqueness of these shapes, these curving shapes, but the composition is all over the canvas. Every area is completely equally filled. And the energy, you can see it just pulsing through the canvas. And it also has a little bit of kind of splash paint, as you can see here. Some of these splashes where he's just kind of flung the paint at the canvas. So this is really his breakthrough picture that was created in 1943. And it now is actually in New York City at the Solomon Guggenheim Museum. It lives at the University of Iowa, but it's been on tour for quite a few years, and it will be at the Guggenheim through the end of September, or no, beginning of September. So if you get a chance to go in and see it, it really is a stunner. It's been beautifully restored. But this is something where he was able to create a completely abstract composition, a monumental composition with that just gels. It just completely holds together. And yet there are figurative references. Many people have likened it to a parade. He himself called it a stampede. So it's got some figural overtones, but it's also got this very, very, very lively, very energetic quality about it. And another influence, another thing that shaped Pollock's creative imagination was the interaction with his peers. I mean, these artists all hung together. And in New York City, this area around 10th Street or around Greenwich Village, around Washington Square, there was an awful lot of nightlife for the artists. You know, they were stuck in their studios all alone all day long. They wanted to get out and talk. They would go to the Waldorf cafeteria and nurse a cup of coffee for hours. They would go to the Cedar Tavern and hang out. On the lower left there, you see Charlotte Park, Jack Tworkov, Mercedes Matter, Jim Brooks, Landis Lewitton. I mean, these are all artists who they weren't arguing about art. They weren't arguing about who's got a deal or who's got a show. They were much more interested in the aesthetic side. And this kind of interaction and dropping in on one another's studios and the give and take was nurtured on the WPA because it was non-commercial. And it carried over into the post-war years. Although, of course, once the gallery system kicked in, things began to become more competitive. And that Elaine de Kooning told me that, when that happened, uh, the artists didn't share as much anymore as they did before it was a commercial system. Well, to get away from that, Jackson and Lee moved to East Hampton in 1945, and they bought this house. As you can see, it was a bit of a fixer-upper. And this was a project, but the idea was to get Pollock away from the Cedar Tavern, away from what he called the wear and tear, because his alcoholism was really threatening to derail his career. But moving to the country actually turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to him, because it opened up his eyes artistically. He was able to get out from under all that pressure. No more going to the galleries and seeing work that you said, I should have been able to do that, or why didn't I do that? Why did Picasso do it before I did? He was able to clear his head artistically and really to come up with his breakthrough period, where he just responded to nature, not as a subject, but as a stimulus. So instead of looking at the landscape and painting what he saw, he studied the landscape, internalized it, and then created his own subjective response to it. So nature was his source, but it was not his subject. Now, the work that he did in the city, like Troubled Queen, you can see it's very pictographic, it's very symbolic, but it's very clotted, it's very dark and heavy. When he moved to the country, his colors lightened up, his compositions opened up. You still have totemic figures, similar to what you saw in the painting called Two, figure here, a figure here. They're doing something, having tea over a table. But so it's not entirely abstract. It's abstracted, but it's not non-objective. You can definitely recognize some forms in it. But what a different feeling. So much more open, so much brighter, and so much more upbeat. Then his next series he called Sounds in the Grass. And these are, again, all over compositions, such as he started with the mural. They're smaller, but you have nature references, nature stimuli, but not nature subject matter. So you can definitely see eyes. I mean, here's an eye and here's another one. But this is a kind of making something tangible that wasn't tangible before, finding a visual vocabulary to express intangible sensations, feelings, emotions. This is what he was aiming for. And this is what he was able to do, beginning with this series. And they all have nature titles, which he gave them himself. Eyes in the Heat, Sounds in the Grass, Croaking Movement, Earthworms. So these pictures were the transition between those more symbolic pictographic images and his all over poured paintings, which he did in this converted barn, which is still there and which you can come and visit. We will be opening on May 1st, so I hope you'll come and see it for yourself. Doesn't look quite like this anymore because he had it renovated in 1953, but this is what it looked like when he was doing the poured paintings that made him famous. And here he is at work. This photograph was taken by Hans Namath, and it shows him working on a painting that's now in the Museum of Modern Art called One, number 31, 1950, and here it is. This is one of his largest and most famous of the poured paintings, using enamel paint, house paint, not because it was cheap. People also think, oh, he went to the hardware store because he couldn't afford artist colors. That's not the reason. He also used artist colors. But the real reason is because it gave him the effect he was after. He wanted this long looping line. He wanted the liquid character of the paint with intense color. If you were to thin artist oil colors to that consistency, you would lose the intensity of the tone. So he needed something with strong color, with liquid character, in order to get the type of imagery that he created here. For 2 winters, he was living in New York City with his wife, Lee, in a borrowed townhouse on McDougal Alley that belonged to his friend Alfonso Osorio. Now, many people don't realize what an important influence Osorio was on him. Not only was he was a wealthy artist, but he also was a collector, and he bought Pollock's work and Krasner's and really helped them out by not only financially, but also artistically, by encouragement, because it's so important for artists when, especially when they're breaking new ground. I mean, Pollock was going into uncharted territory here, and not everyone understood what he was up to. Lee did, but most of the other artists didn't have a clue. And Osorio really got it and was definitely on the same wavelength, although his work was continuing to be figurative. And even though the figures are very veiled, as they are in Pollock's work, you can see there is a child and a child here playing games. But when Osorio started to do this type of work, Pollock saw it, he was impressed with it, and a couple of years later, he started bringing the figure back into his work. And I personally feel that Osorio's influence was very important at that turning point, because Pollock had kind of reached an impasse. He did not want to repeat himself. And he said himself that when you're working out of your imagination, figures are bound to emerge. So he didn't want to suppress that. He wanted to allow it to happen. And I think in many ways, Osorio gave him permission to go in that direction. And so did Willem de Kooning, who was also doing figures at that time and who always vacillated between figuration and abstraction, and who was very well respected by his peers, even though painting the figure was considered definitely out. We don't do that anymore. But once Pollock started doing it, people had second thoughts about that. And here's another from that 1951 series. This is in the National Gallery in Washington. There's a kind of almost a duality here between these very strange kind of sticks, almost like bamboo, and then this rather voluptuous female figure. Again, straight out of Picasso, but Pollock putting his own spin on it. This is just enamel paint on unprimed canvas, very stark. And these works were not sellers. They didn't do well commercially, although the critics liked them. But people wanted the colorful paintings. They wanted the wild abstractions. And these were really not popular. People were more interested in this kind of work, which is one of the largest he ever did, Blue Poles, and one of the last that he did in this pure pouring technique. He, by this time, he had been on the wagon for a couple of years, and unfortunately, at the end of 1950, he went back to drinking, and the more he drank, the less he worked. Another of the Pollock myths is that he drank in order to work. Unfortunately, he drank instead of working. But in 1952, he created this, which is now in the National Gallery of Australia. And he worked on it for months. Another misconception, that he just sort of blurted them out, that he was this kind of drunken paint slinger. But in fact, this took months and months of study and struggle. And finally, he couldn't, according to Lee, he just could not get it to gel. And as a last resort, he took a 2x4, painted it blue, and put it down 8 times on the canvas. And that's what created the so-called poles. Then there was another campaign on top of that, and then it was finished finally. But this kind of consideration and deliberation is something about Pollock's work that I think many people just don't realize, how much he struggled to get the compositions right. Even if they were spontaneous, even if they were improvised, they still had a lot of thought and a lot of consideration behind them. And they weren't just done in a one-off way. Very often he would work on them for months, or he would even work on them again, take them back off the wall, put them down, and work on them maybe even a year later. So there really was much more to it than most people realize. Here's the studio after it was renovated. And you can see that he's got a few works in progress, but they're all kind of different. He was kind of casting about for different directions at this point. He wasn't satisfied to go back to doing the all over abstractions. He was working with figure and also working with these totemic symbolic imagery. So it was very much a searching process at that point. Unfortunately, as I say, his production was declining because of his alcoholism. And in the city, he would go to the Hotel Earl and stay overnight and go to see a psychiatrist who was treating him for alcoholism, but it really wasn't working. This is his last known painting. It's called Search. And in fact, it does look like someone searching for direction. You can see that it has areas of liquid pigment in here and pourings over here. And it's also got a scumbled quality where he sort of dry brushed onto it. And he couldn't even decide which way up it should go. It was originally a vertical picture, and then he turned it on its side and made it horizontal. So it was really an unresolved in some ways because he simply had run out of steam. And his final exhibition in his lifetime was actually a mini retrospective because he just did not have enough new work for the dealer. This is his very last known work, a small sculpture that was made at the home of Tony Smith, an artist friend who lived in New Jersey, and it's a sand casting. Tony's son had a little sandbox, and they scooped out some sand, they poured some plaster into it, and put a coat hanger into it, the coat hanger wire, so that it could stand up and the wings could move so it could be reconfigured. But this is the little experiment that he did. He did 2 of them, and Tony was trying to get him back on track and trying to encourage him. And unfortunately, it just didn't work. A month later, he was dead. And you can see the condition that he was in. Obviously had gained weight, was not fully functional as a person. He was having health problems other than just the drinking. And in the August of 1956, he was in an automobile accident that killed him. Unfortunately, he was also having an affair with a much younger woman, Ruth Kligman. She was 26, he was 44. This picture was taken on the day he died. Unfortunately, there was someone else in the car with him when he crashed. Well, Ruth was there, but a friend of hers who came from the city, Edith Metzger, was also in the car, and she was killed as well. So it was a terrible tragedy, and it ended the life of Jackson Pollock at the age of 44. Unfortunately for us, of course, we don't have the work that he would have produced if he had lived longer. It's always interesting to speculate where he would have gone because his creative imagination was so strong for all those years, but then it was dampened and finally extinguished by alcoholism. If there had been treatment for it, if he'd been properly diagnosed and treated, who knows what he would have accomplished. But unfortunately, this is as far as he got. So that is all I have to say about Pollock's creative imagination. If anyone has any questions or comments, I would be more than happy to hear them.
So far, no questions.
Well, I want to thank everyone for their patience. I really appreciate those who stuck with it.
Is there anyone else who wants to ask any questions? You can put them in the Q&A or the chat room. We'd be happy to answer. I'll give you a minute or 2 in case someone does want to say something. No? Okay. So again, I'd like to apologize for the bumpy start. It's unfortunate we had to start so late, but I think Overall, it was a very interesting lecture, and we would like to thank Helen Harrison very much. And thank you to the audience too for sticking with us. We hope you found the talk both interesting and informative. We'd also like to thank First Republic Private Wealth Management again for their generous sponsorship of tonight's program. Our next program will be a demonstration by our instructor, Bill Graff. It'll be on digital creative composition. So please look out for the email about this. That will be on the 29th of April.
Oh, Gabby, I see there are a couple of questions, actually.
Oh, okay, hold on. Yes, okay. Catherine Jennings, let's see. Can you speak more about his relationship with Peggy Guggenheim?
Well, if you read Peggy's memoir, her first book, she talks about how she was his patron and he was her protege. In the second book, she says it was a strictly business relationship. The second book is a little bit later. She's living in Venice, and she talks about how important Pollock became, thanks to her, of course, and that he became the greatest painter since Picasso. But in an interview that she gave late in her life, she said that they did have one night of bliss. Now, Peggy, as you may know, if you've read about her or know anything about her, she did have a lot of lovers. And apparently she tried one night with Pollock, but it did not work out. And in fact, she said he threw his trousers out the window. So you can take that from Peggy, but the relationship was of major importance on a professional level, because as I mentioned, Peggy was a very sophisticated collector of really important avant-garde art. And for her to throw her support behind him, an unknown, I mean, he literally was unknown at that point, 1942. He'd never had a show, that it really made people take him seriously. And from the point of view of, now the war is about to end, the commercial gallery system is about to come in. And if you can get your foot in the door there, you have it made. And so for that reason alone, Peggy was absolutely crucial to his career.
One other question, this is from Mary Keogh. What happened to his brothers?
Well, Charles and Jackson, Charles was the eldest, Jackson was the youngest. There's just been an exhibition at the Society for the Four Arts in Palm Beach of the two of them together. Charles was the artist of the family, and the family joke was that if Charles had decided to become a plumber, all the other boys would have become plumbers too, because they all looked up to him. So 3 of the boys wanted to be artists, and Jackson and Charles were the ones who succeeded. The next brother, Jay was the next one. He actually became a printer and lithographer, but commercial. Frank became a rose grower. He married into a family of rose growers in California. And then Sandy also was an artist, and he and Jackson lived together in New York and worked on the WPA and worked with Siqueiros. But when he married, and had children, he opened up a screen printing shop and really went away from fine art and went more into commercial art. And he created some screen prints with Jackson in 1941, which we actually have copies of at the Pollock House.
Another question from Marlene Bezic. Did Lee Krasner's career suffer because of her relationship with Pollock?
Well, no and yes. First of all, she devoted herself to him, and she did not have a career while he was alive, in the sense that she had a dealer who represented her, annual exhibitions, and collectors who bought her work, and someone to promote her. She chose not to pursue that because she did not want to compete with him, and she was quite frank about that. But after he died, all bets were off, and she had excellent representation, and probably being Mrs. Jackson Pollock helped her to gain recognition. So it's sort of cut both ways, but it was not an easy road for her by any means, because being Mrs. Jackson Pollock had a lot of responsibilities that went with it. She had to manage his estate. She was his sole heir. And so it was up to her to make sure that he stayed in the public eye, that his work was taken seriously, that he got into the right exhibitions, that the publications came out, that the right collectors owned his work, all of those things that go with managing an artist's career. So she had to manage his posthumous career and her own career at the same time.
Do we have any more questions before we close for the evening? I'll give it a minute or two, just in case anyone else would like to ask a question. A couple of comments. We've got Fabio Facciaponte saying, wonderful, thank you so much, worth the wait.
Yeah. And I do hope that everyone will make the effort to come out and visit the Pollock Krasner house. If not, our first exhibition will be of Mary Abbott, who was a contemporary of theirs, slightly younger. And also in August, August, September, October, we'll have the Pollock and Picasso show. Oh, there's a raised hand.
A raised hand. We need, Barbara, would you like to go ahead? Hello? I'm not sure.
Maybe she's just waving.
Maybe, yes, she has the microphone on, but. Okay, so this is from Catherine Jennings. Did he associate with Edward Hopper in New York City?
Not that I know of. Hopper lived on Washington Square, so he was right in the neighborhood. But I don't think, they really were of a different generation and also artistically, poles apart, really. And I don't think that Hopper was on his radar, shall we say.
Anyone else?
There's a couple in the chat room.
Well, that was the Hopper question I saw.
All right, I don't see any more actual, wait a minute, we need one more here. Okay, this is the question from Barbara Stone. Is there any problem with the durability of the type of paint he used?
Actually, no, it's very durable. It's house paint, it's very tough. The problem tends to be more with the support. The canvas can discolor. Sometimes the masonite can chip, things like that. But the paint itself is quite tough. And I've had some lengthy conversations with people who've restored the pictures. And they all say, it's really amazing stuff. And it holds its color really well. The only color change that I've noticed is with the aluminum paint. If it's in an atmosphere where there's pollution, it'll go a little gray. It kind of clouds over, but that can be cleaned.
Okay, another one from Barbara Stone. I've read that Clement Greenberg was very instrumental in promoting Jackson's career. Is that accurate? And if so, would you speak about that?
Oh, definitely, because Greenberg was a very influential critic, and he and Harold Rosenberg were the two who were the champions of abstract expressionism, although there were others who were in favor of it, but they were the two most respected, I guess you'd say. And Greenberg he would make these sweeping pronouncements like Pollock is the most important artist in America right now. And Life magazine picked up on that. And they said, is he the greatest living painter of the United States? This is Greenberg's opinion. And when something like that is broadcast in a magazine like Life, which had circulation of 5 million in 1949, people paid attention. Not that they necessarily agreed with Greenberg, but it got them talking. And the more influential museum curators paid attention. The important collectors paid attention. The general public thought it was crap. But when Greenberg spoke, people listened. The people who mattered, the people with money who could buy the paintings.
Priscilla McDuff is asking, when is the Krasner Pollock House open?
We open on May 1st, and we're open Thursdays through Sundays, but you need to make a reservation. And we do have COVID restrictions in place, so we don't have an awful lot of people on each tour, but if you go to the website, you can make a booking, and I hope you will.
Okay, is there anyone else who'd like to ask a question? Okay. Okay, it looks like that's about it. Again, I'd like to thank you very much for a very interesting talk. And as I said before, please look out for our email for our other upcoming events. And the next one, as I said before, is on the 29th of April, which is a demonstration by Bill Graff on digital composition. And again, I apologize for the difficulties we had in the beginning, but I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you and good night.
Thank you, Gabby. Good night.